I'd like to welcome Dr. Colin Duckett, who's our Vice Dean of Basic Science at the Duke School of Medicine. Thanks very much for joining us today, Colin.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I'm still getting over this reading glass question that just came up that sort of threw me for a loop. But thanks, thanks, Mark. So first of all, I just want to thank Alison, Nicole, Colleen, the speakers today for putting this great day together. Really been some fascinating talks. I've listened to almost all of them. And even for somebody that's not in the field, this has just been incredibly exciting and interesting for me. So thank you for putting this all together and for the community. I have a great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, and this is the 2022 DIBS Distinguished Lecturer, Dr. Marlene Behrman, and we've been hearing her in conversation over the last few minutes, which has been great. Dr. Behrman is the Thomas S. Baker University Professor of Psychology and Cognitive Neuroscience at Carnegie Mellon University. She received her BA in Speech and Hearing Therapy in 1981, followed by her MA in Speech Pathology in 84. Both of those were from the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. She then received a PhD in psychology from the University of Toronto. Her research specializes in the cognitive and neural mechanisms of visual perception with a specific focus on object recognition, as I think we're about to hear. She's a trailblazer and a worldwide leader in the field of visual cognition. She was inducted into the National Academy of Sciences in 2015 and into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2019. She seeks to understand how we understand the world around us, how we break up that world into elements and objects, and how the process of visual cognition goes awry in clinical disorders. And her lab has developed really elegant experimental paradigms that challenge human visual cognition abilities. Her lab and she and her group have explored these paradigms in developing children and adults using brain imaging, and they've demonstrated surprising deficits and competencies in people who have acquired brain lesions or atypical brain development. She and her students have transformed how neuroscientists think about the interactions between visual perception and complex cognition. So Dr. Behrman, we're so thrilled to welcome you today. Thank you for taking the time to come and speak to us. And the title of your talk that you've given us is Hemispheric Organization in the Service of Visual Recognition, Emergence and Plasticity. And we're looking forward to hearing from you again, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, it's already been a really great event with a lot of exciting toing and froing intellectual tennis. So that's been really good. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm hoping that I will be able to share my screen without any problems. I hope that looks okay now.
Okay, Dr. Behrman.
Thanks. Okay, so as you've already heard, I have an interest in hemispheric specialization, and I have an interest in complex pattern recognition in the visual system. And in this talk, I'm going to put those two interests together, specifically to talk about how the cortical hemispheres are organized in the service of visual recognition. I will, sorry, it doesn't work. I'm sorry, I just want to try and change one thing. Okay, I hope you can, this should allow me to use the animations that I've set. So I hope that is the case. Before I go any further, I'd like to recognize the contribution of 4 graduate students in my lab, Michael, Tina, Sophie, and Nick, 3 postdocs, Marge, Vlad, and Erez Freud, and my collaborators, Christina Patterson from the Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh, and David Plout at Carnegie Mellon University, and my funding from both NIH and NSF. To the naked eye, the 2 hemispheres of the brain look rather similar in their structure, aside from some small anatomical differences, like the two patalia that characterize in the majority of the population, that have a more anterior projection in the right hemisphere and a posterior projection in the left hemisphere, giving rise to the slight anti-clockwise torque that we call the Yakovlevian torque. Despite this clear similarity, decades of research attest to substantial functional differences between the hemispheres. And the question I'd like to address today is, what are these functional differences and where do they come from? How do they emerge in cortex? So the popular media would have us believe that the distinction is really quite straightforward. The left hemisphere, as you can see here in this monochrome color, is analytical and boring and puts things together, whereas the right hemisphere is colorful and energetic and is passionate and creative, etc., etc. Even in this image here, you see all the left hemisphere functions in little boring cubicles, and the right hemisphere, flying kites and playing music. A somewhat more realistic depiction shows a strict division of labor between the hemispheres, with the right hemisphere responsible for, among other things, face perception, and the left hemisphere for, amongst other things, word perception. But in fact, we don't have to rely on pretty pictures from the popular press. Hundreds of studies have now mapped out the topography of these functions in the two hemispheres by having a participant lie in a magnet and then showing them on a screen that is sort of embedded in the magnet, images of words, of faces, common objects, houses, and bodies. And there is a very standard result that has now been replicated many, many times, showing that if you look at the inferior surface of the brain, so this is the occipital lobe at the back here, frontal lobe there, this is the temporal lobe, this is the anterior portion of the temporal lobe, and posterior occipital back here. So if you look at these visual areas of the brain on the inferior surface, we typically see that faces are activated by this region and words by this region, objects by a big swath in blue over here, probably because the geometry of the class of objects is so vast, from teacups to knitting needles. And then there are regions associated with representing or being activated for houses or places, and a body area. What I'd like to focus on today is specifically the class of faces and the class of words that show this binary segregation. So right hemisphere activation for faces and left hemisphere activation for words. Notice that I've used the anatomical labels here, or functional anatomical labels, in inverted commas, the fusiform face area or the visual word form area, because in fact we know that these areas respond to a wide variety of visual inputs, not just the face or the word. There is good reason for us to focus on these two classes. In particular, these are classes of visual stimuli with which we have incredible experience and amazing expertise. So a 20-year-old recognizes between 5,000 to 10,000 faces, and an adult reader reads about 238 words per minute if nonfiction, or 260 if it's fiction. And so from an efficiency and optimization point of view for parsimony, it might make sense to have this binary segregation, allowing each of these hemispheres to become optimally tuned for their particular class of stimuli. And just like I've argued that there is an empirical basis for segregation, there is also a good theoretical argument for segregation. For example, as is very obvious, the image statistics of faces is so different from the image statistics of words, and their low-level properties so divergent, it makes sense that they should be represented in very different regions of the brain. Another possibility is that words and faces differ in their evolutionary trajectory, with face recognition being around for a long time and word recognition only really being part of the sort of mainstream culture for about the last 150 years. And last, in terms of the acquisition differences, whereas nobody needs necessarily to go to school to learn to recognize faces, this is acquired incidentally over development, children only primarily learn to read in preschool or elementary school, and often require thousands of hours of practice to be able to master this kind of visual pattern recognition. So in today's talk, I am first going to present the evidence for the segregation, empirical evidence for the segregation, which supports this idea of this clear division of labor of words in the left hemisphere and faces in the right hemisphere. I'm then going to challenge that account of segregation and offer an alternative, an account of interdependence, in which I will propose that faces and words share computational principles and in fact share some cortical regions. And it's better to think of these rather than as two entirely separate and segregated regions and functions. We can think about them as more distributed, weighted, and dynamic. For the last part of the talk, I will talk to you and show evidence about how plastic the system is, whereby the topography of face and words comes to be altered and can be altered under some circumstances. Okay, so let's start off with the evidence that really favors the segregation of function. So the neuropsychological data is very clear on this point. Individuals with a lesion to bilateral or just the right occipitotemporal cortical region are much poorer at recognizing faces than any other class of objects and really rely on other cues for recognition. In roughly the homologous region in the left hemisphere, an occipitotemporal lesion on the left side results in an impairment in word recognition in premorbidly literate adults that is termed pure alexia, to indicate that this is not a general language impairment. This is not an aphasia per se. It's a problem in decoding the pattern associated with orthographic input following left hemisphere lesions. There's also a huge amount of electrophysiological data showing, for example, as you see in this case, the N170, so the waveform component, 170 milliseconds after stimulus onset, shown here in this vertical line, with this greater negative deflection for faces, shown in red here, compared to birds, cars, and furniture, and notice slightly greater on the right than the left, but a deflection on both sides nonetheless. And again, in complementary fashion, we see that same N170 waveform for words in the left hemisphere over the right hemisphere. And last, there's considerable evidence from neuroimaging that maybe has supported this binary segregation almost more than any of the other methods. So here in a very early PET study, you can see right hemisphere activation for faces. And here we can see right hemisphere activation in sort of the seminal functional imaging study showing activation for faces in the fusiform face area. I should apologize to you in advance. Sometimes in some of these images, the right hemisphere is on the right of the image, and sometimes the right hemisphere is on the left of the image. I've tried to make a note of it throughout. There is a difference between the radiological convention and our own intuition, but I will try and disambiguate this for you. Okay, just like We saw imaging data supporting face activation in the right hemisphere. There is both PET and imaging functional MRI data showing greater activation for words in the left over the right hemisphere. So together we have these multiple methodologies, all of which provide anchors that support this claim of binary segregation. And we should in fact all just be crying uncle, I believe is the correct expression, and saying, yes, this is indeed overwhelmingly the case. I would, however, like to challenge this view of segregation, and that is close inspection of almost all of the data that I've shown you thus far suggests that the activation is actually not just unilateral. So even here for faces where we see activation in the right hemisphere, you will notice that there is also activation in the left hemisphere, and we see it in these other examples as well. And when we look at the activation of words, as I showed you in the left hemisphere, it turns out there is actually activation bilaterally in almost all of the studies that have been reported. And close scrutiny allows one to see the full bilateral pattern. In a study that we conducted a number of years ago now in Neuron, we had the same observers view both words and faces in separate blocks of trials. And what I'm showing you here is the inflated brain. I hope you can see it here. This is the inferior surface of the two hemispheres. And to the side of it is the flattened cortical representation, so that we can see all the gyri and sulci represented on the same plane, as though we put a cut right through this through the inflated cortex and then used a rolling pin and rolled out the two hemispheres. So in this study, we observed that in both the left and the right hemisphere, as you can see, there is activation for faces and for words, what we called letter strings in that study. But notice that in the left hemisphere, there is more purple, so greater activation for letter strings than faces. And in the right hemisphere, greater activation for faces than for letter strings, suggesting that there may be some kind of weighted asymmetry between the two hemispheres, although both hemispheres have got representation for both stimulus classes. What's also interesting to note here is that if you look at the peak coordinates for faces in the right hemisphere and for words in some regions in the left hemisphere, you can see how close they are, suggesting that these may be homologous regions in the two hemispheres that are carrying the maximal weighting. It's also the case that if you look at ERP studies in the same observers who looked at words and at faces in different blocks of trials, so here negative amplitude is good. So the bluer a region is, the more it represents or more it's activated by that particular stimulus class. And you can see this negative blue bilaterally for words and for faces in the temporal window associated with the sort of paradigmatic N170 waveform. Another reason why we might want to consider the regions in the two hemispheres as being similar to each other, as being homologous, is that there is a slow maturation profile, both on the fusiform face area and on the visual word form area. And so I'm just going to show you two slides showing you the maturational profile of these cortical regions. So when Susie Scherf was a postdoc in my lab, we ran the same experiment that I'd shown you earlier. You show faces and words and houses, et cetera, and you can see again on the inferior surface, but also on the lateral surface, significant activation for faces shown in red in adults, much less so in the left hemisphere, although it is evident. It's just not in the plane that I've chosen to show here. We see a similar profile in the adolescents. But young children, ages 5 to 8, who are already in school, are not showing anything like the mature face representation in the fusiform face area in either hemisphere, actually. So there's this very slow maturational profile associated with faces, and perhaps not surprising given how complex the discrimination is of different faces, all from the other. Every face has got 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth, and yet you have to get these very particular featural and relational representations to make face discrimination. And so this may account for the slow maturational profile. There's also a very slow maturational profile of the visual word form area. So here in adults, we see greater activation in the left and the right hemisphere. This is from the Turkeltaub lab. And in children, age 6.5 to roughly 11.5, kids who are at school, kids who are reading, we're not seeing anything like the adult maturational visual word form area profile. So I'm going to suggest that we not only consider the evidence for the segregation, but if we look really closely, there is considerable evidence against the segregation, perhaps compelling us or behooving us to consider homologies between the 2 hemispheres with some weighted representation in each of the 2 regions. So to take into account all of the data that I've shown and to present additional data, I'm going to propose to you an alternative account from one that just claims binary segregation. We're going to take a deep dive into this account, and to keep for you to keep track of where we are in my outline of the talk, every time I speak about this account of interdependence, there's going to be a red frame around the image, so you can see we're still deep in this rabbit hole of this account. We'll come out of it at some point. Okay, so I'm going to present to you common principles for the neural underpinnings of face and word recognition. In the first principle, I'm going to argue that both faces and words require fine-grained visual discrimination. Faces are also similar to each other. Words all share so many of the low-level properties within a class. So there's such homogeneity within each of these classes. Recognition really relies on fine-grained discrimination, perhaps even foveal discrimination. So I am going to show you some data that both face and word recognition occupy extrastriate cortex, but what would be the extrapolation, the anterior extrapolation of the foveal region into extrastriate cortex. So at the same time that we ran this experiment, whose data I showed you previously, we also collected eccentricity data from the participants in the following way. We showed them in some conditions faces and words either shown in central vision, and this is what this blue schematic depicts here, or sometimes they were shown in more peripheral vision, and the stimuli would be shown in this green region. Participants were always fixating, and we had an eye tracker on them. These are data from a single participant in whom we also measured retinotopic boundaries. And now we superimpose on this individual's retinotopy the purple region that's associated with letter recognition and the orange regions here, I hope you can see the outlines in orange, associated with face recognition. And notice that for both of these stimulus classes in both hemispheres, they occupy what would be the extrapolation of these retinotopic regions into extrastriate cortex. So if you had to choose an area of the brain that you wanted to be responsible for face and word recognition, this is a very good candidate area to choose. Its location is exactly right. Okay, so both faces and words rely on this very particular region of cortex. The second principle is going to be that those regions of cortex that process the same kind of information should coordinate their activation. So let's imagine neurons that are representing words should all come to be clustered together since they coordinate related information. Whereas neurons whereas neighboring neurons or neurons that are close to each other, but that represent incompatible information should be pushed further apart. So things that represent compatible information should go together. Things that represent incompatible information should be separated. So even though both stimulus types occupy the extrapolation of the fovea, they shouldn't be perfectly overlapping. They should cluster as a function of their cooperation or competition. Okay, and in fact, that's exactly what we saw in this imaging study that I've already shown you. I'd like to show you a new version of this study that I think illustrates this idea of clustering for coordination and competition in slightly more detail. So again, these are flattened maps of the left and the right hemisphere. Individuals in the study, we have 28 so far, it's actually we're collecting more data, see both faces and words. This is a group average map where words here are shown in blue and faces are shown in red. I wish we would have just used purple and orange like we did in the previous slide, so I apologize. Notice that this is activation in Broca's area in the left hemisphere. And as we saw before, both hemispheres have got both types of information, words and faces, with words represented to a greater degree in the left hemisphere and faces to a greater degree in the right hemisphere. And in fact, if we look at the selectivity of the neural response for words in the left hemisphere and for faces in the right hemisphere of these observers, we see a very nice relationship, so that the more that words are represented in the left hemisphere, the stronger faces are represented in the right hemisphere, as a good illustration of the competition in the competition for neural representation between these two stimulus classes. You might be wondering, however, given that we see this bilateral representation for faces and words, why we would ever see a deficit like in these individuals with prosopagnosia or puralexia. Why wouldn't it be the case if you had an impairment, a lesion to right face area? Why doesn't the left hemisphere just pick up the slack and be able to assist in the recognition of faces? This drove us to look more closely at the individual profiles. So of these 28 individuals, these are data from single participants. Here are two examples of two participants who show bilateral representation for faces and for words. But it is possible to find individuals who show more unilateral patterns, as you can see here, pretty much only red in the right hemisphere and only blue in the left hemisphere. And it's my conjecture that these individuals down here are the future puralexic and prosopagnosic individuals. So there are differences in the extent of unilateral versus bilateral representation within individuals. And it's this strong unilateral representation that puts people at risk of having puralexia or prosopagnosia. And in fact, these disorders are rather rare in the population at large, as is true even in our 28 participants. You could ask, what determines whether somebody has bilateral representation like the majority of the population or unilateral representation. So I can't tell you the answer just yet, but one of the things that we're doing as well in this collection of these new data is having very detailed diffusion imaging, which allows us to look at the connectivity both within and between the cortices. So we are currently exploring individual variability in the corpus callosum with the prediction that the smaller the volume of the splenium, so if you've got a very small splenium which connects the visual cortex, there will be more lateralization. But if you've got a greater splenium, you will have less lateralization because there'll be more interhemispheric communication. So that's one possibility in thinking about the connectivity through the corpus callosum and particular segments of the corpus callosum, seeing these differences just in the splenium, but not in the genu. Another possibility that determines individual variability has to do with the within hemisphere connectivity. So both the inferior longitudinal fasciculus and the arcuate fasciculus may play an important role in determining whether there is unilateral or bilateral representation. So the stronger the within hemisphere connectivity and the stronger the connectivity to the arcuate fasciculus, the more likely it might be that language and the visual word form area will be unilaterally represented in the left hemisphere. So I don't have the answer just yet, but I'll get back to you on this one. Okay, the last principle here has to do with why it is when we see this weighted asymmetry that there's greater activation for words in the left and greater activation for faces in the right, albeit binary. And this has to do with the particular topography that's going to drive this hemispheric organization. And the principle that's articulated here is that there is strong pressure in the brain to keep areas that are cooperating close to each other, as I'd already articulated previously, which means that in the left hemisphere, where language regions are for the predominant 90% of the population, or certainly 100% of, almost 100% of the right-handed population, language regions are in the left hemisphere, and you want those language regions to be close to the visual regions and optimize the left hemisphere for word processing. And by default, the right hemisphere for face processing. So let me try and lay this out in a little bit more detail. So the claim is that initially in very young children, both occipitotemporal cortices are going to be involved in face recognition. When children begin to learn to read, and there is an acquisition of word recognition, so there becomes coupling between these left hemisphere extrastriate visual areas and language regions in the left hemisphere as a function of this constraint to minimize wiring length in cortex. And as this coupling becomes strengthened, there is consequent, albeit not binarily so, lateralization of faces to the right. And it's through this pressure to keep connectivity and wiring length short that we see predominantly word representations in the left hemisphere and predominantly face representations in the right hemisphere. So I'm going to show you some data that is going to depict this developmental emergence of this bilateral, albeit not binary, representation. So we started off by doing some behavioral studies with adolescents, adults, and children. Experiments are pretty simple. They sit in front of a computer screen, fixation point comes up, a face comes up for long enough for young children to be able to encode it well, very brief fixation to prevent saccades, and very brief exposure duration of a stimulus that's presented to the right or the left visual field, and participants are required to say if they are the same or different, and the response keys are counterbalanced. They do the same experiment with words. These are separate blocks of trials, and we can now explore the visual field or hemispheric superiorities associated with faces and words over the course of development. So in adults, plotted here is accuracy on the y-axis, and this is for faces and words. In the blue is stimuli in the left visual field, and in this yellow is the right visual field. So notice that when faces are presented to the left visual field, accuracy is higher than to the right visual field, as we would well expect. And when words are presented to the right visual field, i.e. to the left hemisphere, accuracy is higher than when words are presented to the left visual field. Notice here as well that even in the other hemisphere, accuracy is still pretty high, about 80%. There's not singular representation of faces on one side and words on the other side. So if we look at the young adolescents, we actually also see this superiority for words in the right visual field over the left visual field, but we don't see any differentiation for faces. And when we look at young children, although their accuracy as a whole is much lower than in the other two groups, we also now see an emerging superiority for words in the right visual field, that is the left hemisphere, over the left visual field, suggesting that it might be this earlier emergence of word lateralization that is going to then go on and give rise to this face lateralization. And so the claim here is that it's the pressure to learn to read that's going to drive the emergence of face lateralization. And in the same group of individuals, just in the young adolescents and the children, we obtained their reading competence from looking at a standardized reading measure that I'll just call here their reading comprehension percentile. And that's correlated with the degree of lateralization for faces. So the better the reader is, the more lateralized they are for face recognition, supporting this idea that it is really reading competence and it's the acquisition of reading competence that is subsequently driving face lateralization. We also collected some ERP data in a new group of just adults and just children, and we basically replicate the result that I'd already shown you earlier. Adults show this difference. I'll just note here that I'm plotting negative amplitude going up just to be consistent with the behavioral data. But more negative is better for faces over the right hemisphere and for words over the left hemisphere in the adults. And we also see this lateralization preference for words, but not for faces in the young children. We have, in a recent paper that just came out in PNAS, we've incorporated these three principles, including the need for fine-grained visual discrimination, the competitive and cooperative dynamics between neighboring neurons, and the pressure for the language in the left hemisphere to exert on word reading, all in the context of a deep neural network connectivity constrained computational account, so a wiring cost computational account of topographic organization. And the simulations and the findings line up very well with the empirical data that I've just shown you and explore some other possibilities as well. Okay, so what I've shown you so far is that in contrast with the claim of binary segregation of words in the left hemisphere and faces in the right hemisphere, there seems to be a much more distributed spread of these representations in both hemispheres in the majority of the population, with there being this weighted asymmetry which arises from the pressure for connectivity of words, language regions, and extrastriate regions in the left hemisphere. The last question that I would like to ask is whether it always has to be this way. Is there something absolutely predetermined about these three principles that I've just articulated? Or is there malleability of this topography? And if so, under what conditions? So we already know that in adults with focal brain lesions, an injury to the left hemisphere, or lesion in the left hemisphere, gives rise to this profound pure alexia, this word recognition deficit that is not very easily remedied and in fact persists for decades in these patients. And the same is true for individuals who after a right lesion have prosopagnosia, which is profound and persists over decades. So there seems to be very little opportunity for reorganization or plasticity in these adult brains. But of course, these are necessarily the brains that we should be looking to if we want to examine kind of the upper bounds of plasticity. We should look in a pediatric population. So I'm going to show you for the rest of the time, I'm going to show you data from kids who have had large surgical resections to remedy their drug-resistant epilepsy. So these are children who are having 20 to 30 epileptic seizures a day. It could not be managed pharmacologically, and the recourse has been to remove those regions of cortex where the epileptic focus or foci emerge. These days, actually, there is a little bit of a sea change, and that is to take these kids to surgery earlier because there is plasticity, as I will show you as I move along through my slides. So we're going to study kids with very large lesions, much larger than the focal lesions in the adults. And we are going to examine the residual capabilities of their remaining preserved hemisphere. And specifically, we're going to examine whether these three principles, fine-grained acuity, cooperation and competition, and topography, can operate over a single hemisphere in these cases. So this is just a quick illustration. It used to be the case, like last year or the year before, that these kids came to the hospital before they went to surgery. The skull was opened, a grid of electrodes was placed on the surface of the brain, and this was used to identify regions associated with language and motor function in these individuals. These days, we are collecting data from depth electrodes that are being implanted in these individuals. So it would no longer look like this. They'd be putting depth electrodes in the regions where the focus is likely, the epileptic focus is likely to be, and the surgeons can then determine the response profile of that very particular region. And we can also run experiments while these kids are in the epilepsy monitoring unit. In fact, right now, I have 3 of my students at Children's Hospital in Pittsburgh collecting the stereotaxic EEG data from these depth electrodes. And there are only about 8 or 10 electrodes that are ever implanted, and they've got about 8 channels on each. Okay, so this is just to show you a kid who subsequently went to resection. Here is the MRI afterwards. We have never seen any resolution of the hemianopia in these kids. Obviously, there is an occipital resection here. And so I just want to set aside right in the beginning that these kids have got a persistent hemianopia We have not seen any remapping of the contralateral field to the ipsilateral hemisphere. This is one of the cases I'll talk about at length. You can see that he's got a tumor here in the right hemisphere. This was resected. He was hemianopic for the left visual field, and this hemianopia never resolved. In fact, when we scanned him multiple times at age 9 and at age 10, in contrast with a matched control who's showing very nice retinotopy in both the right and the left hemisphere for the contralateral field, this child is showing only activation in the preserved occipital cortex in the left hemisphere for the right visual field, but not for the ipsilateral field, where in the left hemisphere, there is no mapping from ipsilateral left visual field stimulation. But there is consensus in the field that despite the homonymous hemianopia, majority of these post-surgical children have got a pretty good visual outcome. And I'm going to explore this visual outcome as we move along. The first data that I'm going to show you are from kids with an entire hemispherectomy or hemispherotomy, in which a little bit of tissue might be left for particular sort of surgical regions. We have data from 24 patients, kids with left surgery, and 15 patients with right surgery. And the question concerns the opportunity for reorganization in the single hemisphere, and particularly whether these three computational principles can operate just over one hemisphere. So I'm going to just show you behavioral data now. The experiment is pretty much like the one that I'd already shown you for our developmental population. A word comes up, and in this particular case, it comes up again centrally, or faces come up. And we've also done these experiments where the stimuli are presented just in one field or the other field. Okay, so we are going to compare normal participants, matched participants who have got two hemispheres compared to the patients who've just got a single hemisphere. And we'll also ask, does it make a difference if your single hemisphere is just the right hemisphere or the left hemisphere? And does it have to do anything with the localization of language areas in these kids that gives rise to this wiring constraint? Okay, so here are the behavioral data. This is the accuracy. In blue here are from control participants. We've also got age mapped here, but we don't have to worry about age so much in these Violin plots. So these are the controls for faces in this panel and for words in this panel. And then we have patients who only have a left hemisphere or patients who only have a right hemisphere. And as you can, what I particularly want to point out here is that the mean of the left hemisphere and right hemisphere groups is around 85%. And even though it's statistically lower than the control participants, who are around 95%, it doesn't seem to matter for face recognition whether you have just a preserved left or just a preserved right hemisphere. And moreover, both hemispheres, each hemisphere can give you about 85% accuracy. The same is true for words. It doesn't matter which hemisphere is preserved. Accuracy gets to be around 85%, not entirely normal, but much better than would be predicted if you only had faces in one hemisphere, or if there was only the capacity for words in a single hemisphere. So this is just a summary, 85% in each hemisphere. This is true for both stimulus classes, and it doesn't matter which hemisphere is removed. So, the one thing that I do want to point out, in all of these individuals, the language is in the preserved hemisphere. So in patients who've only got a left hemisphere, their language is in the left hemisphere, as is true of the population at large. But in those patients who only have a right hemisphere, their language has already remapped to the right hemisphere. They are verbal, they have reasonably good, albeit not normal language. And it's not surprising then that you can see word recognition emerging in their right hemisphere through this coupling, presumably, to language, between vision and language. Okay, so we know a little bit about the topography in these cases. What I'd like to look at now is this idea of there being competitive and cooperative mechanisms. And what I'm going to do is show you longitudinal data. So I'm going to show you the emergence of these competitive and cooperative mechanisms. Here, I'll just show you 2 case studies. And as you can see, they have a seizure and then they go to surgery, and we scan, in these cases, we're scanning them roughly every 6 months, and we have data for up to about 3 years in these cases. I think I'm only going to show you data for roughly 2 years. Okay, just to tell you that we have good data control, good TSNR across these sessions every 6 months. So differences are not, any differences we see are not a result of differences in the data quality, and also we control motion, etc. Okay, I first want to show you some data from children, from the control participants. At this point, we only had 26. We've now got something like 43. And part of the problem with these longitudinal studies is that we have to collect data for each time point where we're scanning. So if they're 10 years old, we have to have matched 10-year-olds. And then when they are 10.6 and then they're 11. And we can't seem to get a lot of longitudinal data from individual controls. So we also have cross-sectional data from new matched controls that we bring into each of these matched age cohorts. Suffice it to say that in the control kids, we see very much the pattern that one might expect. So faces here are shown in bright pink. You can see both hemispheres show activation for faces in the fusiform gyrus. We see activation in the left hemisphere for words. I'm sorry, you can't see it underneath here, but smaller activation for words in the right hemisphere as well. Again, this is kind of the pattern of binary, but sort of bilateral, but not binary segregation. Okay, so what I want to show you now are data from the single individual who's called UD, the one, in fact, whose tumor I showed earlier on. We started scanning him post-operatively at age 7 years, 10 months, and I'm going to show you 4 scans that we have from him. What I really want you to focus on is you can see face selectivity in his single residual left hemisphere. In pink, you can see face activation in the left hemisphere. We don't really see anything in the right hemisphere. I hope you can see that this is the resected occipitotemporal cortex. And in the same individual, we also see word activation, which kind of emerges over the course of development. That's all well and good. We really want to understand what's happening under the hood here. So we are going to now sort of put a spotlight over this region, which is where both face and word activation is seen in this individual in the preserved left hemisphere. Again, this is the resected right hemisphere. And this is the volume that we're going to be looking at. And I just wanted to show it to you in the 3 different planes so that you can see where we are zeroing in on. So what I'm showing here in this cube are all the voxels contained in this 3D volume. And each voxel here is colored as to whether or not it's more face selective, that means the more red it is, or it's more word selective, which means the more blue it is. And you can see here at the first scan, there don't seem to be a lot of voxels that are strongly committed one way or the other. They sort of hovering in this kind of mid-region of selectivity. But as UD grows over time, we begin to see a kind of separation into more red voxels and into more blue voxels, in line or consistent with the claim that neurons that work together should come to cluster together, think Donald Hebb, so that in abutting regions, but pretty much in the same volume, in a single hemisphere, we can get to see both face and word selectivity kind of co-localizing but adjacent. And we see significant change when we test these voxels over this entire duration. This may not be that surprising to you to see both face and word activation in the left hemisphere, because even in the controls, we're seeing both face and word activation in the left hemisphere. So let's look at the perhaps more dramatic case of somebody who's had a left resection, and now we're only looking in their right hemisphere. And sort of the question is, what happens to word representations in the right hemisphere? So here we have just 3 scans in this individual. She had her surgery only at age 13, and we scanned her on 2 subsequent occasions. We know that language is now represented in this individual in the right hemisphere, not in the left hemisphere. Language has already moved over, even though she still has left hemisphere Broca's and Wernicke's areas as well. And here are just face and word activation. I hope you can see this little bit of orange in the preserved right hemisphere. And if we look at that same volume in the right hemisphere now, over time, as we did previously, again, we can see that there is an emergence of clustering of face selective voxels here in red and word selective voxels here in blue, within this preserved right hemisphere. And this is perhaps a more dramatic finding, that word recognition switches over to the right hemisphere, because it's usually not that evident. It's present, but it's not as big as you see face recognition in the left hemisphere. Nevertheless, in such an individual where language has moved over to the right hemisphere, or where there's bilateral representation of language, we are seeing the coupling of the visual word form area with language in the right hemisphere alongside the activation of the fusiform area. So I'm going to end off here by just making a couple of general comments. I have attempted to articulate an alternative account of the emergence of the topography of functional specialization or superiority in the hemispheres through these 3 computational principles. In the case of faces and words, the principles have to do with fine visual acuity, and so the anterior extrapolation of the fovea. The second principle has to do with clustering of neurons that cooperate versus compete. And finally, the wiring cost to link up with language. But it turns out that if you look more broadly at other literatures, for example, at the hemispheric specialization or superiorities in the anterior temporal lobe, we also see some of these same properties emerging. So even though the widespread wisdom was that the left anterior temporal lobe had more verbal representation and the right was more non-verbal, it turns out that there is in fact more graded bilateral representation with this weighted asymmetry. in the anterior temporal lobe. And I refer you to the work of Grace Rice, that she has a review and a meta-analysis that you might want to look at, or some of the individual empirical papers. There is also a hypothesis in the literature that concerns dorsal visual cortex, parietal cortex. So in general, the received wisdom has been that the left parietal regions are more involved with language, and the right parietal regions more involved with spatial representations. But there is a proposal, particularly by Otto Karnath, that has argued that both hemispheres have both language and spatial representations, and that over the course of development, as language becomes more refined in the left hemisphere, so spatial representations become more refined in the right hemisphere in this competitive dynamic that I've already illustrated here, using faces and words as the example. So I'd like to end off with the sort of appeal, I guess, to not only the scientists, but to the popular press as well, that it behooves us in the face of all of the empirical and theoretical data that we don't have a simple binary segregation between the hemispheres. The topography is much more nuanced and much more complex. And so instead of suggesting this, very simplistic and perhaps now naive view, we might really want to think of the hemispheres as having more bilateral representation. So the sad left hemisphere, in fact, has some happy activities, and the happy right hemisphere has some analytic abilities. And so I hope to leave you with the key message that the hemispheres have more of a graded interdependence, and that the emergence of this interdependence plays out over development, and that there is considerable plasticity with these three principles playing out even in a single hemisphere under these boundary conditions in hemispherectomy. And the last thing that I'll do is once again thank all of the students and postdocs and collaborators for their contribution to this work. And I will just leave a summary up as I go to take the questions. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a real privilege being able to present my work and participating in the trainees and the faculty sessions earlier on today.
Yay, thank you, Marlene. That was fantastic. I'm going to try to control the noise on my end. People are coming home from school and work as I work here. So we had one question from the Q&A session from Andreas. Have you had the opportunity to assess the permanence or long-term evolution of these regions in these pediatric patients with hemispherectomy or otomy?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question, because you do want to know whether or not this plasticity that I've been articulating actually hangs around in cortex, or whether over time it goes on to do some other, amazing acrobatics. I don't know the answer to this question. We've only been doing these longitudinal studies for about 5 years now. All things being well, in another 5 years, we will still be able to access these individuals and be able to scan them. And I'll be able to address something about the sort of the durability, the long-term permanence of this reorganization.
Great, thanks. Colleen, is it possible for audience members to unmute and ask in person, or should I just read these off?
You should read them off. It'll probably be the easiest thing to do.
Okay, this one's from Simon Davis then. He says, lovely talk. Any thoughts about how more distant hemispheric, like left-right communication, interacts with the more local competition, and how these long-distance interactions might change with task or age?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. Gosh, I wish I had better answers for these questions, but I'm not sure that I really do. I think it is worth recognizing, as you correctly point out, that there are both long-range connectivities and short-range connectivities, and they may play different roles, and they may play different roles over the course of aging, with shorter term connections being more robust and durable than long-term connections. So I certainly don't know how the change in the connectivity over time influences the organization. I suspect, as we know from the adult cases, that there's not a lot of plasticity into adulthood and presumably not into aging either. And so that seems to be a sort of somewhat concretized or static system at that stage already. But in thinking about the long range and the shorter connections in terms of the account that I've proposed, I haven't thought a lot about it, except to say that we are exploring individual differences and the individual variability in the normal participants in the long range connections like the inferior longitudinal fasciculus or the infrafrontal fasciculus compared to, say, the splenium, which is a much shorter connection. So I think the jury is out for the moment, but I will at least soonish be able to tell you whether or not the within hemisphere long-range connections or between hemispheres shorter connections play a more primary role in the emergence of the topography, these individual signatures of topography. Thanks for the question.
And Simon or anyone, if you have follow-up questions, feel free to just enter them back in the Q&A box, since I can't seem to call on you directly. So this is a question from Jim Vojovich. Sorry if I mispronounced that. In my experience, children show more bilateral language function in pre-surgical fMRIs compared to adults. And neurosurgeons are careful to avoid resecting semantic language areas when it is strongly unilateral. So in your left hemisphere resections, was there not significant right hemisphere semantic language function preoperatively? And behaviorally, do you see differences in the rate of recovery in lexicographic versus semantic language function?
Great. Well, hi, Jim. I ran my first ever imaging study when Jim was in Pittsburgh and learned a ton from him. So I really need to express my gratitude to you, and especially for your patience in those early days. You make an important distinction here, and that is between semantic language regions and more what you call lexicographic, or what I will think of as kind of sensitivity to the orthography, sort of perceptual functions. Roberto also kind of looked at this distinction in the work that he presented earlier by looking at more perceptual representations versus looking at more semantic representations further along in the anterior temporal lobe. So I can't really answer your question because I've never really probed the language regions other than these perceptual regions, and then just knowing about Broca's and Wernicke's areas, but without really exploring the full language circuits in these kids. It's a really good question. It's something that I can do. It's something that I should do. And so how about I just get back to you on this one? And thanks for the great suggestion.
Great. Let's take a couple questions from the panelists. Roberto, did you have a question?
Yeah, well, great talk and data. So, following, I mean, your points about the splenium and also Jim's question about changes during development. So I mean, there is general kind of evidence for increasing lateralization with age and or the reverse, I mean, with aging, right? So when we see that decrease in older adults often is related to decline in white matter, right? So
Yeah,
including the
exactly.
splenium. But you actually kind of suggested that, perhaps I understood correctly, that actually development of the splenium or development of white matter would actually kind of have a greater kind of differentiation. I don't know, how do you see the effects of white matter in the children and older adults?
Yes, that is in fact exactly what I'm suggesting. I'm claiming that the sort of the innate, the inherent white matter connectivity, which differs across individuals, plays a formidable role in determining the extent to which there is more unilateral or more bilateral graded representation in each individual. What I can't definitively tell you yet is whether or not this determination is made more on the basis of the strength of the interhemispheric connectivity through the corpus callosum or through the unilateral connectivity of these long-range fiber tracts like the inferior longitudinal fasciculus. So it could be a within hemisphere, or it could be a between hemisphere white matter profile that goes on to determine the unilateral or bilateral topography.
Thank you very much.
Sorry?
Please go on. I thought that you had finished.
Oh, we do, your point about aging is a good one though, because we do know that in aging, there is already some kind of degeneration, decomposition of the myelin, which compromises the integrity of these tracts, particularly the long-range tracts. The longer your tract is, the more myelin it has, and the more vulnerable it is in aging. And we, in fact, have got an aging study that I never included and didn't think about, that in fact shows that you can get more unilateral activate. Let me go back and look at it, but I think we have the data that will allow me to specifically address this question of within or between hemisphere connectivity as a function of age. We have 80 participants whose data we have over age. That's
Great.
both DTI and a functional MRI.
Looking forward to that. So
yeah, thanks. Good question.
Great. Allison, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. Well, that thank you for that really, I think, beautiful and satisfying and parsimonious layout of how these specializations emerge and how dynamic they are, you know, and how they relate to structure. You know, what are how the sort of constraints of the biology are setting up these gradients of function. And I think the question that I have is, you know, I hope this is a fair question for all of us to think about, but you know, that's about how extreme the development trajectory is, but it doesn't really answer a fundamental question about where the bias in hemispheric specialization comes from to begin with. And so, you know, we used to talk about, and I think you laid out here for us, how learning language and incorporating that new expertise, you know, affects our lateralization. But the findings a few years ago that even mice have more than we thought they did, right? And so where this comes from to begin with is the question. Do you?
It's a great question. I mean, something I spend a lot of time thinking about, because it's not by chance, it's not random which hemisphere language is represented. You know, the majority of the population, it's in the left hemisphere. So I want to give you an example of the kind of theorizing about this issue that exists. One of the one of the contenders for the fact to account for the fact that language arises in the left hemisphere in humans is called the Peloponnesian War theory. And what this theory says is that in the Peloponnesian War, there were fighters who kept their shield over in their left hand and their spear in the right hand. And these people survived the war because their shield protected their heart. But their counterparts, who had the shield in the right hand and the spear in the left hand, they died in the war. And we are all the offspring of these, valiant Peloponnesian warriors. Obviously that doesn't quite, suffice, and we are not fully convinced by that. And so I think and especially given that we know that that there are some differences in laterality in mice, and they don't have small shields and small spears in their own version of the war. So it's a little bit like kicking the can down the road. So one perhaps reasonable theory is that the left hemisphere is able to monitor rapid changes much better than the right hemisphere. And these can be rapid temporal changes, like in speech and language, or even rapid changes like in the visual domain. So the fundamental difference between the two hemispheres is in monitoring the rate of change. And that seems a bit better. And yes, okay, that's why language turns up in the left hemisphere. But why is the left hemisphere able to monitor the rate of change? Why isn't it just one hemisphere, either hemisphere? So I don't know the answer. It's really an important question. I would love to hear other people's thoughts on this. I have no idea why there is this sort of fundamental bias in the left hemisphere for language.
Well, my kids have asked me why the heart is on the left side of the body. So, we might as well ask that kind of question.
That's right. Yeah, we could go into a long story. I have a real interest in kind of the more the phylogeny of lateralization. One of these days, I'm going to really drill down on it. Not that I'll find the answer, I don't think, but.
Thanks, Allison. Thanks, Marlene. Jenny, did you have a question?
I do. First of all, that was just an amazingly wonderful talk, really gripping. So my question is really a question that I think Jamila Minga, a new professor in the communication sciences department, would ask if she were here at the moment. And she studies the language deficits that occur with right hemisphere damage.
Yeah.
And one of the things that she has pointed out is that the deficits, it's not a simple kind of aphasia sort of deficit, but it tends to be more at the level of discourse and communication and how you use a conversation to exchange information with someone else. Yeah. And I'm wondering, so it's kind of language in the social domain.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, and maybe in particular, like, is the face representation that's in the right hemisphere sort of slightly more social than the face representation that's in the left hemisphere, or is there something on that axis that emerges from your studies?
Yeah, great. This is a really good question. And actually, I'm happy to receive it because in my old life, I was a speech pathologist and worked with adults with aphasia, but also with adults with right hemisphere lesion who had communication impairment. So this is sort of a chance to revisit the old me from a long time ago. And in fact, in the literature as a whole, there is, I think, consensus that there are communication impairments following even focal right hemisphere lesions in patients whom we know to be left hemisphere language dominant. and those impairments are often ascribed to something like a meta-linguistic function, like engaging in narrative discourse, or sort of the more social, prosody, for example, the more social aspects of language. I think the evidence is strong that there is this kind of distinction. I have not really thought about it in relation to the sort of the word versus face representation. But in fact, Jenny, you offer a really interesting idea, and that is that these right hemisphere language capabilities are kind of capitalizing on the social aspects of face representation in the right hemisphere. So, maybe I can even sort of go full circuit on this and not only talk about the pressure of the left hemisphere, but also talk about the newfound bounty of the right hemisphere as language regions and facial, interpersonal regions in the right hemisphere come to be coupled. Thanks.
Neat. I think Lindsay has a related question.
Yeah, I did. I mean, I was really taken by the strong correlations between the degree of lateralization and then the discriminability for these different stimuli.
Yeah.
And so that kind of makes sense in terms of the evolutionary pressure towards lateralization potentially.
Yeah.
But it seems that there's still a lot of variability, and that there's still a huge bilateral representation. And so I was kind of wondering if there were any tasks that people that had less lateralization that were better at. I mean, one possibility is that they're less susceptible to trauma and damage, but that's usually that's not something that's super evolutionarily built in. And so I was wondering about something, maybe you show us faces. What if you pair those, like the words of the names of those people with those faces? Is that something maybe that people that are less lateralized would be better at making those associations and that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a really good question. We did do a study that tried to look at this, and the study did the following. It had trials that included both faces and words, and the faces and words could, with equal probability, appear in the left or the right visual field. And they had to make some kind of judgment that incorporated both the face and the word information. This was like the third experiment of Eva Dundas's PhD thesis. And we could not actually determine a clear result. That those individuals who were more, this is the way we did the experiment. We knew which individuals had more unilateral versus more bilateral representation, and then we ran them in this particular experiment. And we couldn't find a neat lining up of the more bilateral ones doing better in this two-field task than the unilateral ones. So I'm thinking along the same lines. You're right, though.
I'm sorry, just going to interrupt. I wonder if that maybe is also a feature that you did it bilaterally, that you maybe want to put the two stimuli in the same field in order for them to be processed in the same hemisphere.
Yeah. Actually, that is in fact even a better idea, because now you really are capitalizing on the dual representation in a single hemisphere. Well, thank you for just solving the experimental dilemma, because now I know what we ought to have done and ought to do going forward. But I do want to emphasize one of the points that you made in your question, and that is that this idea of bilateral representation has often been touted as being advantageous because you are more resistant to injury. And in fact, one of the, received wisdoms is that women have more bilateral representation than men do. We actually have not looked at that in our data, but have the data to look at it. And it's one of the reasons why there are fewer women with puralexia or prosopagnosia or even aphasia than there are men. But it's a little bit of hearsay, and I wouldn't take this as scientific doctrine just yet. But the point is interesting, and I like this idea a lot.
Marlene, I have a big picture dumb question as a non-expert. How do you know, I don't know, from your own studies or from others, the extent to which these lateralization results would apply cross-culturally? So faces are constant across cultures. As you said, there's 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, but language can be represented visually in many, many different ways,
Yep.
from Chinese, Mandarin characters to Arabic script to the
Yep.
English that we all use primarily.
Yeah.
Has that been studied in detail? Have you looked at that? Do these lateralizations, are they just independent of the mode of communicating that language visually, or does it matter?
So we know a few things, actually not from my own work. Let me rather tell you about people who got strong results. The work has focused almost, I actually can't, there is no study that I can cite that looked at face and word representations in cultures where there is more bilateral visual word form areas. So like in Chinese, for example, when Chinese readers are reading ideographs, so like the little picture kinds of things, you actually see pretty bilateral activation in the visual word form area. Sort of, from the get-go, it is really quite bilateral. I have never seen a study that looks at face perception in those same individuals and sort of explores the topographic consequences of this very balanced bilateral visual word form area induced as a function of the properties of the written language.
I guess even bringing that to an extreme, I'd love if a group developed a language where the words were faces. So you have a face language in sentence structure semantics. I mean, emojis are essentially like that, or rebuses.
Yeah.
So I'll just set that out there because you look like you're nodding and have something to say about that.
Well, I can just tell you about one study that it tried to do something like this. It was actually done by our colleague, Julie Fees at the University of Pittsburgh. She and her collaborator developed a kind of face language. It's not quite what you have in mind, but they made words out of little faces. And they showed that in an imaging study that you could, let me try and think what they showed. They first showed that people can actually learn to recognize words made of faces. That was the first finding. And I think they showed that there was strong right hemisphere activation for this new face word language that they had developed. But it's hard to get people to learn a new language, kind of a new orthography. And they would need so much time to become as expert at it as they are at reading their native language. And so it becomes a tough comparison. I think even the Chinese ideograph readers may be a better model to examine this, because that is in fact their native expert domain.
Yeah. Jenny?
Quick question on this
Sorry.
same kind of line. What about reading music? Is that lateralized?
Yes, it seems to be. And again, sort of, so a lot of this is like the general consensus, which I sometimes call the received wisdom, which I think we also might want to call facts that remain to be evaluated, is that music and reading music is a property of the right hemisphere. So it's kind of hard to know what to say. Again, I mean, one can run such a study. There are expert musicians who are as fluent in reading sheet music as they are in reading their native tongue. And we can look at those individuals who have more bilateral representation of the visual word form area, those who have more unilateral, and we can actually map out, I think, with some precision, the relationship between their reading of music notation and their reading of their native orthography.
So many experiments we could come up with, just even in this panel.
Anytime I need to write a grant, I'm going to ask if I can give a talk at Duke, because essentially you've just given me, another 15 years of work to do.
Yeah, I was thinking that Allison needs to wrap up, but I was just thinking of math too. When you become really good at math, it just becomes its own fluency and you're reading it just like a language.
Yep.
Yeah. I'll kick it over to Allison.
Well, thank you all, and thank you especially, Marlene, for giving us not just the lyrics, but the tune for this amazing discussion. And to all of our speakers, and especially our students and postdocs who started us off sharing their own work with us, I really want to thank you all for a magical discussion, and wish we could take you out to dinner and continue it and toast you in person. But
I'll take a rain check.
Yeah, great.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone. It's been really delightful.